After an extended period away from the public eye, Brian Wilson finally returned to performing in 2022. But as the musician took the stage and the crowd saw him for the first time in years, their excitement turned to heartbreak. He was the musical mastermind behind the Beach Boys, but between the bars of his surf songs and pop polyphonies, he proved to be an equally brilliant and burdened man.
Over hill, over dale, we have hit the dusty trail, and those caissons go rolling along.
As an infant, Brian left his family stunned when he recreated the melody of When the Caissons Go Rolling Along after only hearing it once. From that moment, Brian's father knew that he had a musical prodigy on his hands. He himself was a part-time musician, but a full-time tyrant. While he encouraged Brian and his siblings to pursue their musical talents, his methods were described as violent and cruel. By the time he was 12, Brian had used his perfect pitch to teach himself piano and already played solos in the choir. Somehow, he also managed to find the time to shine in sports, such as football and baseball. However, the only team he was really interested in playing on was his own. He taught his brothers Dennis and Carl to sing, laying the foundation for their future success as the Beach Boys. Before he hit puberty, he already had their first hit in his head. He spent almost every waking moment in his early adolescence obsessing over the harmonies of the Four Freshmen. He would rush home after school, carefully listening to their melodies by ear. He was so obsessive about music that his brother Carl called him a freak. In school, he regularly defied his music teacher's instructions and flouted traditional music theory, believing that he knew better. His defiant behaviour earned him an F in his piano and harmony course. Despite failing his music class, Brian went on to El Camino College in Los Angeles. However, when he learned that his music professor disliked pop music, he dropped out. In 1961, Brian decided to team up with his brothers, cousin Mike Love, and classmate Al Jardine to form a band, the Pendletones. Before long, the entire world would know them by a different name. As they were still in their teens, they had little to write about. However, Brian's brother Dennis suggested they write a song about surfing, one of Dennis's other passions. It wasn't long before Brian and Mike Love had composed Surfin', and had Brian's father Murray present the track to a record producer. Given the nature of the song, the record label insisted that Brian and his bandmates change their name to the much more apt Beach Boys. The rebrand helped catapult Surfin' to the top of the LA airwaves and made the band into an overnight sensation. Less than a year later, they signed a deal with Capitol Records and released their debut album, Surfin' Safari. Capitol recognised that Brian was the brain behind the Beach Boys and allowed him to produce music for other artists. But when he produced the #1 hit single Surf City for Jan and Dean after only reaching #3 on the Billboard pop chart with the Beach Boys single Surfin' USA, trouble began brewing. Capitol Records, along with Brian's father, forced him to cut ties with Jan and Dean and rededicate himself to his original band. Brian felt constrained by Capitol Records and his overbearing father, but then he came up with a brilliant idea. He pitched a female band consisting of 3 sisters called the Honeys to Capitol, billing them as the female Beach Boys. The band was a commercial flop, but a personal triumph for Brian. During this period, he became close with the Ravel sisters of the Honeys. In fact, for nearly 2 years between 1963 and 64, Brian moved into the Ravel family household. While the songs that he produced for them didn't heat up the charts, he sparked a romantic interest in Marilyn Ravel. 1964 turned into Brian's nightmare when a British band called the Beatles debuted in the US with their single Please Please Me. And for Brian, it was personal. He believed that Paul McCartney would be his biggest rival. He responded to the Beatles' arrival with his greatest song to that point, I Get Around. The single topped the charts and ensured that the Beach Boys were still relevant during the British invasion. However, as the pressure to produce, perform, and perfect Beach Boys hits mounted on Brian's young shoulders, his musical mind was turning into a cacophony. The first signs of his fragile state of mind began to appear in late 1964, but no one knew exactly how bad it was until December 7th, when he made the impulsive and unexpected decision to marry Marilyn Rovell. On December 23rd, not long after their plane to Houston took flight, the sharp tension that had been building in Brian finally snapped, and so did he. Without warning, he started crying and making shrieking noises. He screamed into a pillow, spun out of his seat, and sobbed on the cabin floor, leaving his bandmates speechless and terrified. They agreed to send him back home to rest and recover, but he would never truly come back. What was meant to be a brief hiatus from the band and his domineering father turned into a never-ending playlist of psychological torment. Despite his fragile mental state, Brian became a highly sought-after music producer and befriended the agent Lauren Schwartz. Finally freed from his father, Brian was able to try new things, and Schwartz was only too happy to oblige. Through Schwartz, Brian learned about literature and philosophy, religion and mysticism, and, most worrying of all, powerful psychedelics. Far from curing his nervous breakdown, Brian's first acid trip dialed up the volume of the noise in his head. However, it also unleashed the more untamed side of his creative genius. During this first trip, he conceived of the riff for California Girls and described the introduction of the song as the greatest piece of music he'd ever written. During this time, he developed the album Pet Sounds, but his behaviour became increasingly troubling. Pet Sounds, Brian's most personal expression yet, was a hit with Beach Boys fans, but only moderately successful with wider audiences. The lukewarm response left him mortified. For the next few years, he continued producing increasingly introspective sounds and isolated himself from the outside world. As his mental state declined, Brian's father, Murray, forced him to sell the Beach Boys publishing company. According to his wife, the sale left Brian devastated. Shortly after that, his behaviour deteriorated drastically as he attempted to drive off a cliff and began digging his own grave in his backyard. As his erratic behaviour seeped out into his public life, the list of troubling incidents only grew longer. He attended a meeting with music executives, having painted his face bright green. He showed up to other musicians' performances, jumped on stage and performed songs in a bathrobe. But things really went off the rails when, in 1973, Brian's father died. Without a strong manager, he became rudderless, going in and out of psychiatric facilities, recklessly spending his money and venturing out into public in his pyjamas to beg for rides and substances. His poor diet and addictions saw him gain up to 240 pounds. Coupled with his bizarre and self-destructive behaviour, Brian's wife knew that something had to be done. She turned to the celebrity psychiatrist Eugene Landy and his controversial 24-hour therapy program. Under Landy's careful supervision, Brian's condition improved. Not only did he lose his excess weight, but his behaviour stabilised. With an apparent return to sanity, he rejoined the Beach Boys for the band's 20th album, 15 Big Ones, in 1976. When he joined his bandmates on tour, it became apparent that he hadn't fully recovered from his nervous breakdown. As tensions ramped up, he confessed in an interview that he felt like a prisoner. Despite his recovery having stalled, Landy raised his monthly fee for Brian's 24-hour program to more than $20,000 a month. Shocked at the staggering cost, Brian's family decided to fire Landy, instead handing over his care and supervision to his cousins. When the Beach Boys signed a deal with CBS Records in 1977 that compelled Brian to compose most of the new material, he broke out into tears, knowing that the deal would require him to return to the recording studio full-time. Following a dismal Australian tour, Brian went missing for a short period, hitchhiking through Hollywood, and eventually ending up at a gay bar where he played piano in exchange for drinks. He convinced one of the bar's customers to drive him to Mexico before hitchhiking his way back across the border to San Diego. Eventually, authorities located the musical mastermind sprawled out under a tree in a park. He had no shoes, no money, and no identification. Not surprisingly, Ravel had had enough of Brian's erratic and self-destructive behaviour. His marriage ended in divorce in 1979. For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factinate member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details. Instead of getting Brian the help he needed, his brother and Beach Boys bandmate Dennis manipulated him into secret recording sessions by plying him with drugs and burgers. When the rest of the family learned about these hamburger sessions, they distanced the brothers from each other. By the time the rest of his family intervened, Brian's food and substance addictions had already taken their toll. It wasn't until after a near-fatal overdose in 1982 that they forced him to sign over control of his finances and business dealings. Then they turned to the only man they believed could save Brian from himself, Landy. His family knew that he would never simply go back into Landy's program, so they concocted a scheme to lie to Brian, telling him that he was flat broke. Moreover, they said that he wasn't a part of the Beach Boys anymore, but that he could still earn an income. All he would have to do is go back to Landy. Landy himself agreed, but he had one condition. He wanted full control over Brian, with the promise that nobody else would get in the way. It seemed to work, at first. Landy subjected Brian to an intense health and counselling regimen, isolating him and even turning away his children and ex-wife. His only contact was with Landy's aides, who dictated his every waking moment. Slowly, Landy took over more of Brian's life, positioning himself as the troubled genius's business and creative partner, even replacing him at Beach Boys meetings. No one could argue that Landy's methods hadn't yielded results, but with his increasing involvement in Brian's creative and professional affairs, some began to doubt his motives. Critics accused Landy of playing puppet master, controlling Brian's thoughts, actions, and even his music.
Brian Wilson is a perfect example of the fact that in my field, I'm an artist.
Landy convinced Brian to strike out on his own and release a solo album. He released his eponymous debut solo album in 1988 to rave reviews from critics and surprising commercial success. However, his old band stole the spotlight. They released their first ever Brian-free song, Kokomo, around the same time, and watched the track soar to #1 on the charts. In October 1991, Brian released his memoir, Wouldn't It Be Nice? My Own Story, except it wasn't exactly his story. It was later revealed that large portions of the book had been lifted from previous biographies. Mike Love, Al Jardine, Carl Wilson, and even Brian's own mother, Audrey, filed defamation lawsuits for the lies they claimed he spread in his book. By the end of the year, his family had succeeded in breaking off Brian's toxic partnership with Landy. A restraining order soon followed, cutting the psychiatrist out of his life for good. In close succession, Brian lost the two most protective people in his life, his brother Carl and his mother Audrey. Without their support, he allegedly fell into the clutches of his second wife, Melinda. Though some credit her for keeping Brian connected to his music, many speculated that she was manipulating him into producing more of it. Brian's daughter even went so far as to call Melinda Landy, in reference to his old psychiatrist. By the late 1990s, Brian had set out on his first solo tour, taking his musical genius all the way to Japan. The once reluctant performer had clearly transformed. He insisted that he loved performing, but not everyone was convinced. They looked for telltale signs that someone else was pulling his strings. In one interview, in a candid moment, Brian admitted he didn't enjoy performing. Then, as if on cue, his handler immediately chimed in, telling Brian that he did, in fact, enjoy performing. In 2011, Brian secretly reconnected with his former bandmates to re-record Do It Again, fueling reunion rumours among the Beach Boys' most ardent fans. When asked about returning to the band, however, Brian was blunt, confessing, "I don't really like working with the guys, but it all depends on how we feel and how much money's involved." Apparently, a lot of money was involved. He joined the band on tour, leading to the release of That's Why God Made the Radio in June 2012. In 2019, his declining mental health forced him to postpone tour dates, and his social media posts hinted at his internal strife. His final performance came on July 26, 2022, in Michigan. Reportedly, those who attended the show described him as rigid and expressionless, as if he were watching the world from a distance, detached from the music that had once consumed him. On January 30th, 2024, Brian lost his wife and strongest advocate, Melinda Ledbetter. She'd been his rock for nearly 3 decades, pulling him out of Landy's grip and helping him reclaim his independence. Without her, he was adrift. Then, the following month, the public learned the heartbreaking truth. Brian had been diagnosed with dementia. Since 1965, he had lived with schizoaffective disorder and mild bipolar disorder, tormented by distressing auditory hallucinations. The voices whispered, taunted, and sometimes even inspired him, shaping the music that defined his legacy. He called them his heroes and villains. In the end, Brian survived for less than 18 months after losing his beloved wife. On June 11th, 2025, his family announced that one of music's greatest geniuses had died at the age of 82. In the message, they included a heartbreaking send-off, using the phrase "Love and Mercy," the title of Brian's breakout single from his first solo album.
Who determines, Brian, what will be done next?
Well, I guess I do. I don't know.
If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. If you want a say in who we cover next, join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.